I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, this is the Ford Mustang Mach 1, and Ford says this is the best handling factory-produced Mustang that's ever come to Australia. Today, we're going to find out. So what exactly is the Ford Mustang Mach 1? Well, Mach 1 is one of the longest running special badges applied to the Ford Mustang. The first one came along in 1969, the last one came along in 2004. So it's been quite a long time between drinks. And this is also the very first time, of course, the Mach 1 label has been attached to the current generation Ford Mustang. And as we know about this Mustang, this vehicle is quite different to all of the versions of Mustang that came before it. The World Mustang is kind of how it was referred when it launched, with things like independent rear suspension and factory right-hand drive. So all the Mach 1 editions have a very good chance of making this actually quite a special driver's car. Now 700 are coming to Australia, so it's not a particularly limited run of cars, but what this car actually gets under the skin is quite interesting. There's a whole bunch of parts from the Shelby GT350 that make this an altogether better car. There's alterations to the engine, the suspension, the exhaust, and of course all the visuals that you see here, and I'm going to run through all of those things in today's video when we get the Mach 1 out onto the track here at Sydney Motorsport Park. But we'll also have a look around the car and inside to see what you get for your money. And how much is that? Just over $83,000 before on-road costs. But if you haven't subscribed already, do so down below and let's get cracking. So aside from the rather loud colouring of this example that I've brought along today, which I think looks pretty fantastic, the main changes you're going to get to the Mach 1 are focused on making the Mustang a better car to drive than in stock GT form, effectively. This is the Mustang you should buy if you're actually looking to acquire one of these cars to drive it hard, as opposed to just kind of enjoying the innate cruising abilities of a 5-litre Mustang. Now it is still 5 litres in displacement. There are no massive changes to the engine. Instead, a bunch of components are switched out for stuff you get on the Shelby GT350 in the main in order to beef up the overall system here. So that means we have the open air induction system from the GT350, we have the throttle bodies, we have an auxiliary oil cooler on this engine. There's also an additional and changed oil cooler on the automatic gearbox version of this car, but of course keen drivers are going to want the manual, which is what I've got here, which keeps the Tremec 3160, but it beefs up all of the components in order to make this effectively better for aggressive on-limit driving, Ford says. Now we also have a retuned exhaust system around the back with 4.5-inch pipes, which makes a pretty good noise, as we'll find out later in the video. Visually, the way you're going to immediately tell the Mach 1 apart is basically all the retro styling that you get on this car. There's a bunch of good colours. I think the orange is probably the best, but you can also go red, blue, white, grey and black, and they each have a different feature colour. On the orange, of course, it's black with a little white stripe and a tiny subtle little Mach 1 sort of logo embossed there into that bonnet stripe. Now there's also a unique fascia here at the front end, darkened Mustang logos as well, some cues from the original 69 Mach 1, and all of this extra aero, which actually gives 22% more downforce. There's also a separate under tray and whatnot to help in that department. And we've got unique 19-inch wheels here, finished in this matte grey, all very 60s and 70s, as is the original typography used on the Mach 1 badge around the side. Matte mirrors as well. As you can see, there's just subtle aero additions around the car. You can tell it's a little bit more serious. And then here at the back, much like the Bullet Special Edition, you don't actually get a Mustang badge around back. Instead, it's just Mach 1. Pretty cool, I reckon. And you can see those mega pipes, which are absolutely massive and make a massive sound too. Plus, finished off nicely with this matte grey lip spoiler. Jumping inside the Mach 1, naturally a lot of the cabin of this car is familiar. It's only a special edition Mustang at the end of the day, so you're getting most of the parts you'd grab on a standard Mustang GT. Not that that's a problem, because the facelift current gen Mustang actually picked up heaps of new materials. It's a quality cabin, it looks and feels good, and it actually, you know, while this is an expensive car, no doubt, at over 80 grand, I think you definitely can hack it, because it's a nice place to spend time. Now, in terms of what you get that's special on the Mach 1, in the cabin, it's mainly limited to a Mach 1 badge up here ahead of the passenger with a unique number for the chassis of the car. Now, in this one, it's PP022. There are 700 coming to Australia, so I think this number will tick up to 700. Ford haven't confirmed that, but I'd say that's most likely to be the case. Now, you can get a couple of options in here to take the car a little bit further. We've got the $3,000 Recaro seats, which are really great, and even though that's steep pricing for an optional seat, I think it's worth doing. There's also a $1,000 appearance package you can buy, which adds orange stitching to better match the outside. This car doesn't have it. It's probably something I would also tick if you could stretch the budget even further. But as for the rest of the components in here, as I mentioned, we've got the manual, got this nice little white ball shifter down here, but everything else is pretty much classic current gen Mustang. We've got Ford's Sync 3 touchscreen down here. It's simple, it's intuitive, it's quick and easy. Wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto is standard. We've got full digital gauges. They're pretty customizable. They look really cool. And we've got orange backlighting in there. Well, not really backlighting. We've got highlighting in orange, which matches the car nicely. Steering wheel, I've always thought this was a little bit large on the current generation Mustang, even though I understand it kind of is a retro touch of its own. Lots of buttons going on, lots of shortcuts, but, you know, like anything, you will get used to it if you own the car. And, you know, material quality is actually pretty good in the Mustang. It feels reasonably premium, and given everything else you get on this car, I wouldn't be too upset at spending over 80 and getting this interior. So it does the job. We've also got 2 seats in the back and a pretty decent boot as well. But naturally, this isn't going to be any kind of practicality superstar. It's about the driving. That's where we're going next. So what does it cost to run a Ford Mustang? Well, if you buy one of the 5-litre V8 versions, naturally fuel consumption is going to be a fairly extensive part of your running costs, but it is entirely manageable depending on the driving that you do. Sometimes bigger displacement actually means a more relaxed engine, which means you don't have to push it as hard. And so in the GT Mustangs we've tested, this Mach 1 is a little bit early to say precisely, we've managed to get about sort of 12, 13 in mixed driving. Obviously, if you're on the car, it's going to be closer to 20. If you're on the highway, you'll probably be able to get it just under 10 without trying too hard. The warranty on the Mustang is 5 years and unlimited kilometers. And in terms of insurance, well, the median budget direct customer in the last 12 months spent $1,177 to comprehensively insure a new Ford Mustang. Now, of course, your premium will vary based on things like your driving history, how you garage the car, who drives the car, and where you live, but you can find a more detailed premium by going to budgetdirect.com.au. So, what's the Mach 1 like to drive? Well, as I mentioned, we've brought the car out here to Sydney Motorsport Park. So first thing, track's still totally quiet and cold. But, you know, it's a big track, it's a fast track, it's a good place to be able to evaluate a brawny muscle car like the Mach 1, and that's exactly what the Ford Mustang is, but particularly in Mach 1 guys. This is meant to evoke that 60s and 70s spirit of the Mustang, of a bit of Americana. And to be honest, well, it's kind of a car of sort of 2 personalities, because, well, it certainly looks, you know, that kind of 60s Americana way from outside the car. The actual driving dynamics of the vehicle are refined and accomplished. There's really no relation to how an original Mustang drives at all. The current generation Mustang is such a sophisticated vehicle that while it's, you know, it's still brawny, fast, muscular, sounds pretty good, as you can hopefully hear, it's actually much more of a world-class performance car than it's ever been, largely because the chassis was finally given a half-decent going over and rear suspension in the current generation car, and the Mach 1's alterations just take the whole package even further. So the basics remain fairly similar to a standard Mustang, but you've got stuff like a retuned exhaust, which is welcome. You've got a retuned suspension, different setup on the Magnaride dampers and whatnot. But then in the engine and transmission, everything's just beefed up for more track work and more hard driving on a good road. So the 5-litre V8 remains the same unit. Power jumps from 339 kilowatts to 345 kilowatts. Torque remains steady at 556 Newton meters. So it's not really about being faster than a Mustang GT, it's about being more durable and having more stamina. And the way that Ford's achieved that is via the modifications I've already mentioned, largely by dipping into the parts being used for the Shelby Mustangs in the US, specifically the GT350. And so, you know, the main difference in how the car accelerates and drives is that it's just more free revving. 7,500 RPM redline remains about the same, but the engine just wants to get there in a bit more of a free capacity. And then we've got things like the auxiliary oil cooler on the engine, just to let you keep going harder for longer, basically. And then the bits and bobs taken from the GT350, like the open air induction system, like the 87mm throttle bodies. It's all about just creating a heavier duty or higher duty version of the 5-litre V8. You know, you could kind of call it an updated V8, but it's not really. It's more just a V8 with auxiliary or replaced parts to help you out in this kind of work. Same thing for the manual gearbox. The feel remains much the same, really nice short shifter. It's an easy car to drive. There's just so much torque that, you know, even if you're not a particularly accomplished manual driver, it couldn't be easier, basically. There is also a 10-speed automatic version of this car, but I just don't see why you would. I mean, I am not a huge fan of the 10-speed auto Mustang. That's an awful lot of ratios, and it hunts a lot in my experience. There's also been issues with overheating, and the Mustang's going into limp home mode with the auto gearbox. Now the Mach 1 has a totally different transmission oil cooler for the auto in Mach 1 guise, which is likely designed to address that situation. But personally, I just avoid the problem entirely and go for the manual gearbox, especially because, you know, it's such a positive feeling gearbox. It's so easy to drive. The clutch is predictable, the take-up point is natural. I can't see a reason to not get the manual. If you think I've missed something, you can let me know down below in the comments. The pipes back there, those fat pipes, they sound really good. You know, it's a satisfying car to drive in that way. We have other parts from the standard Mustang, including the LSD at the rear end. But, you know, it's like other Mustangs, it's not a light car, it is brawny. It is heavier than some other options, but it throws its weight around well. It's controlled, particularly on the Mach 1's updated, revised suspension. It's predictable. The steering I really like. Really natural ratio. You kind of look at this car and you think it might have unnecessarily heavy steering, but it actually doesn't. It's not stupidly light, but it's just, I don't know, predictable, nice, natural, feels good in the hand. You can see the end of the sort of gently flared nostrils on this car, so you can pick a line easily through the corners. The seating position is a little high, but it's not disruptive. It's not a GR Yaris, put it that way. Now, of course, we can't talk about road driving dynamics yet. The Mach 1 hasn't been released. We're getting an early drive today, but I think from my impressions here, we could have something quite interesting on our hands. Now, 700R coming to Australia. It's not a cheap car, but it'll be interesting to get that road drive done to fully assess the value proposition here. First impressions though, very positive. So, the Ford Mustang Mach 1. Really enjoyed a first drive today here on track. Looking forward to getting this car out onto some really good Australian roads in future, because this is effectively the kind of work it's designed to do. The track on Saturday, road driving on Sunday, a really good mix of all of the things we like from a performance car of this caliber out here in Australia. So stay tuned for our road review of this car coming later on. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to do so below the video, hit that notification bell, leave me a comment, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.